All right, John Dailey, welcome to the show, brother. Thanks for coming on SOFcast. How you doing this morning?
Thanks, Matt. Doing great. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
No, I'm excited to chat, man. I'm really excited to dive into Det One and your role, as the predecessor and, to Marine Special Operations Command and MARSOC and all that stuff. But I want to kind of set the stage first. I've talked about it on previous episodes of this show. If you would ask me when I was in middle school or high school, like, hey, if you're going to join the military, where would you go? What would you do? I would have said Marine Force Recon, right? And I know that's the path you initially took. Kind of walk us through your path of joining the Marines and becoming a recon guy and how that all unfolded for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I born and raised in a little mountain town and kind of on the West Virginia border, and knew from an early age that I didn't really have the grades to do much else. My parents couldn't have afforded college, if I had the grades to go. So from a really early age, I knew I wanted to be a Marine, and that came close to changing when Rambo came out. I think for a lot of people of my generation, the idea of being a Green Beret sounded really, really cool. But I lucked out, and as I was going into high school, I happened to run into the Marine recruiter and told him that hey, Green Beret sounds really cool. And he was like, well, hey, we have Force Recon, which is even cooler. And, you couldn't just Google something, back, this was a long time ago. So, you had to go to the library and check out books and read. Sure. And, once I started learning about Force Recon, I knew that I was set. I got to still be a Marine, which I'd wanted to do for a long time, and, kind of operate at a level that, I was looking for, the challenge I was looking for. So it took me, almost 5 years, from the time I came in. I very fortunate start. I got to go into a sniper platoon right away, get trained as a sniper, and then spent some time in the infantry, and worked my way up eventually into Force Recon. And it was a job I loved, every minute of.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, as you're making that transition, you become a sniper, you're an infantryman. What was that selection process like? What was the accession process and kind of the training to get into Force Recon and become a Recon Marine?
Yeah, the biggest problem I had was, though I had grown up in lakes and rivers and ponds, I really didn't know how to swim nearly as well as the average Recon Marine is supposed to. So it took me a while. I got a dose of reality, the first time I got thrown into a pool and told, hey, 500 meter cross stroke. I'm like, I don't know what a cross stroke is, or, a backstroke. I knew what, the only stroke I knew was kind of like a modified doggy paddle that was somewhere close to maybe a breaststroke. But it was, enough to get me, across the lakes, when I was a kid, but not enough to get me into Force Recon. So I really had to work on that. At the time, the selection process was incredibly grueling, but it was really condensed. So it was just a day called the NDOC. Then they would run that, sometimes once a month, some maybe more, maybe usually not more than that, but sometimes less. And you would have to travel from whatever unit you were at to the Force Recon unit closest to you, and take the selection. So I had taken it in infantry school and failed it because I couldn't swim. Yeah. And I took it on a deployment in Okinawa and with the recon unit there, and passed. And then when I got to First Force, I had to take theirs again. And it was, brutal. Just a brutal day. There's, now most assessment selections, obviously SF and MARSOCs are much, much longer in duration. But, you can do a lot to a man in 12 hours of just nonstop. We went from, Marine Corps physical fitness test to the pool, and spent a good bit of time in the pool, to a really long foot movement through the hills into the ocean, and a lot of time in the ocean, and then a really long foot movement back with stops and kind of everything else in between. And it was I don't know if it's the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's definitely right up there.
Yeah, it definitely sets a watermark for later in your career as you're going through some of the other stuff. One of the interesting things about the Marine Corps and now MARSOC, which I know they just celebrated 15th anniversary, and I know you're there now, and I want to get to some of the stuff you're doing with some of the training in NDOC now. But at the time prior to you guys at Det One and then MARSOC standing up, Force Recon had a ton of the skills, a lot of the people, all the things that we would consider from the outside special operations. I know when I was a kid, growing up, reading those books and seeing those things, I would have thought that's a special operations unit, right? But it didn't fall under kind of the SOCOM banner. It wasn't under those authorities, under some of the, funding and things like that. As you're working your way up through MARSOC, through Force Recon, how was that looked at as like, hey, there's all these other kind of special operations from the other branches? What was the kind of temperature there pre-Det One as you were working your way up?
Yeah, we actually just celebrated 19 years.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So,
yeah. I got my date wrong.
Next year is the 20th. But I think there's absolutely a difference between special operations and U.S. SOCOM. So I think that Force Recon units have always been capable of executing special operations missions, and really until 1987 when SOCOM was formed, their playing field was pretty even. I feel like when you read back about Vietnam and the MACV-SOG, there were people from all of the components in their SEALs, Force Recon Marines. So it really wasn't until right as I was coming in 1987 when SOCOM activated that change happened. The Marine Corps elected not to participate in SOCOM, and that would definitely have an impact on the Marines in Force Recon. For a while in the early 90s on both the East Coast and the West Coast, there was a pretty large campaign of poaching guys away from Force Recon to go to SF or to go to the Air Force Special Operations, primarily some to the SEALs. But I believe, I think 92, 93, 2nd Force Recon lost nearly an entire platoon, about like 30 Marines that went off, somewhere else. And, on occasion on deployment, we would run into these guys who are now a PJ, and they're talking about how awesome life is, the missions they're doing, the equipment that they have. And so it could be enticing, right? But, never, for me, it was never nearly enough to make me think of making a change. I loved being a Marine, loved everything about the Marine Corps, and then being able to be a Force Recon Marine on top of that was really special. But after 9/11, I was finally worked my way up to platoon sergeant. So I was a Force Recon platoon sergeant, which I felt was the greatest job in the world at the time. We'd gone on deployment, sitting in Australia, having a beer when the soccer game turns into Tower One coming down. So we knew that, we were rushed back onto the boats, set sail, landed off the coast of Pakistan, took aircraft into Afghanistan. And the first mission that was going to be launched to do some reconnaissance on the airfield that we were going to land in, that wound up being called Fob Rhino. We were all set to do it, and we had requested to use SOCOM aircraft, and we were told, no, the SEALs will do it because they're special operations and you guys are not, and it's a soft mission and it's soft aircraft. So that was really like a big kind of slap in the face, and that's
sure. They're like, hey, Recon's in our name. We're pretty good at it.
Yeah, we're real good at it. So that was that was a really frustrating moment, but it was also I didn't know it at the time, but the wheels were already kind of set in motion. The Secretary of Defense had decided that there needed to be more special operations, and SOF would kind of lead the fight and the war on terror. So by the time we got back from that deployment, and we had a successful deployment to Afghanistan in November, December, kind of January 2001-2 timeframe. By the time we got back, there were already rumors that, hey, the Marine Corps is going to start up a unit that's going to be attached to SOCOM.
Yeah, and during that time frame, like you said, you had worked your way up to, as an enlisted guy, I'm the same way. Like team sergeant for a Green Beret, best job in the world. You're kind of working your way up to being in charge of a group of of really highly qualified guys that are your responsibility to train and lead and all those things, but they are hungry like the wolf, right? It's a great honor to be at that sort of level and be able to lead that type of force. When did you start hearing about Det One? Because you get selected as one of the initial team leaders. Like, how did that come to you? Was it just out of the blue, or had you really started hearing those rumblings that your name was going to be involved?
I hadn't. I had heard some rumblings that the unit was going to be formed,
Sure.
and I was. I initially didn't even dawn on me, that because I'm like, there's so many people that could be picked for this, and I was, had returned from deployment and was had actually been moved from Force Recon to at the time was called the Special Operations Training Group, and I was leading their urban sniper course and their urban reconnaissance and surveillance course, and while I was there, a colonel that had been my boss at Force Recon, came up to me and said, "Hey, have you heard the rumors about this unit?" And I said, "Yeah, I have." He's like, "I'll tell you something, but you can't tell anybody. I'm in charge. I'm going to be the commander. Do you want in?" And like, yeah, obviously. I mean, how could you not?
One of the worst questions to ask anybody in this kind of career field. Hey, you want in? Like, yeah, I don't even know what it is yet, but I'm in.
No. And what role, exactly I was going to play initially, I didn't know. I thought that I was going to be the platoon sergeant for this unit. And, later, when they started like racking and stacking who the other team leader is going to be, who the platoon sergeant was going to be, I was like, man, I'm just incredibly honored to have a place anywhere, at the table here. So I wound up being one of initially we had 4 teams, so 4 team leaders, and was pretty much given which never happens, right? The ability to pick my guys. So it was, the Marine Corps was obviously very concerned about us poaching, everybody, all of the best guys from Force Recon. So there were some limitations on who we could pick, who we couldn't. We wound up actually bringing some guys back in the Marine Corps who had gotten out and were doing other things. So we, wound up relatively quickly identifying and selecting the roughly 30 men that was going to make up the assault platoon, the shooters, if you will. And then while that was happening, there was, intel guys who were doing the same thing. And they wound up selecting about, almost the same amount, about 30, intel guys from kind of all walks of intel life, SIGINTers, humaners, GON. And then, somebody else was picking all of the other stuff, the JTACs, the communicators, the admin clerks, the supply guys. So we were initially chartered for 87 men, and that wound up expanding a little bit to roughly 100. But that's, when the dust cleared, that's what we were at and what we deployed with.
Yeah, it's like a dream scenario. It's like one of those team room talk things where you're like sitting around the team room and you're talking about, either the formation of some of our special mission units or, MARSOC or special task force for whatever. And you're kind of sitting around after training and you're like, oh yeah, I'd pick this guy, whatever. And you had that role of like, hey, you're going to get to pick your guy, which, like you said, never happens. It's rare to meet plank holders of any unit, right? Because most of us, especially for my generation, you come in and you're standing on the shoulders of these giants that have already built these units, and you're one of them for MARSOC, right? Like you get the opportunity, John, pick your team, get after it. What were you looking for? Obviously you had worked with most of those guys, but as far as like qualifications and really more like capabilities and, different attributes, what do you remember kind of thinking through as you're discussing this with the other team leaders and kind of picking those guys? What do you remember looking for?
Yeah, I think I had the good fortune before my platoon sergeant time at Force Recon to have been in the training cell. So
Right.
I didn't see it as a good fortune then. I spent nearly 2 years, just waiting for my shot at a platoon. But because of that, I got to watch, every, platoon go through and kind of be a part of them going through their training, evaluating them. And so I had probably the best overall perspective on kind of who was who. So, for me, it was less about, what skills does this guy have? Is he most of us were divers and free fallers and, almost all of us just by kind of happenstance wound up being snipers. So we had really a lot of capability, but, more was, who are people that I want in my team that I can, I know I can trust. I know I can get along with. I know have the, the smarts, to
Sure.
help kind of plan these missions and build, something that was, a very kind of nebulous, mission. Right? We had little idea what we were going to do for the first roughly half of our workup. We were under the impression that we were going to go to Afghanistan and do primarily long range reconnaissance. And we were given a year, right? A year from no people, no equipment, no, no weapons, no nothing to get all that stuff and deploy. So about 6 months in, we're really heavily focused on Afghanistan and on long range reconnaissance. And we get told, no, by the way, you're going to go to Iraq. You're going to work underneath a SEAL task group, and you're going to focus on targeting HVTs. So it was, we needed to have people who were smart enough to operate, kind of independently in ambiguous environments without a lot of direction. And that's really what I looked for. But I think the biggest thing in any special operations unit, you've got to be able to get along with each other.
Sure.
If you can't do that, then it really doesn't matter how good you are. There's going to be issues.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's one of those kind of soft ethos things of like, hey, I need you to have the work ethic. I need you to have the skills. I need you to have all those things. But if you're not a team player, this is a tightly knit, out in the middle of nowhere, problem solving under a lot of stress all the time. And I don't need a superstar that's a detractor from the overall team, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I need that guy or gal that is wired tight on all the skills, but also can help out those left and right of them and doesn't cause more issues than they solve, because we've all had those issues before.
Yeah, and quite often, like you said, the really long ball hitter, is when they know that they're we really needed people, and we were kind of kept humble because we're a relatively senior group. The team leaders were all E7s, E8s, which in the Marine Corps is unusual. All right, I mean to have that much ranked together. By the end of the deployment, we were almost all E6s, E7s. So it was hey, somebody's got to scrub the shirts, right? Somebody's got to sort the brass. Somebody's got to and it was don't care what ranks on your collar. There's work to be done, and that was frustrating at times, but it was also, I think, the mentality that we started with, and that mentality certainly helped make us successful.
Yeah, and it's uniting through a lot of the special operations units, right? Like obviously, as you know, same thing for us as Green Berets, and then a lot of other tribes. Like you go to another school or something else where you're kind of intermixed, and you see E6s and E7s that are used to not having to do those things. You're like, bro, that's just normal business. Like as an E6 on a team, that is my job. And so it's great that you guys were able to have that much of a workup. And, I have to imagine that 6 month in period, you thought you're going to Afghanistan. You guys have been to Afghanistan before as Force Recon Marines. You've done long range reconnaissance as your bread and butter. And now all of a sudden, halfway through the train up, it's like, hey, new country, new mission set, new command authorities, all those things. What do you remember about kind of shifting that priority and what you guys really started to establish? And then walk me through it, kind of that initial infill in, because this was the proving ground for, like, is MARSOC going to be a thing?
Yeah.
Right? Is there going to be a special operations? Do you remember, I guess as another follow-on question, as I've added like 3 in there, but do you remember the talk of like, hey, this may only be for this, or was it already like, hey, we are going to set the standard so that this becomes the new, kind of Marine special operations wing?
Well, there wasn't, especially down, kind of at the team level, there was not a lot of, there wasn't time really to think about, what comes after this. But the thing that we would kind of always kind of beat into each other's heads is, don't be the reason that MARSOC doesn't happen. All right. Don't be the guy who screws this all up. So that was the mentality, I think with all of us. So, when we realized where we're going, what we're going to do, we had always spent a lot of our time in pre-deployment, deploying with the Marine Expeditionary Units on direct action.
Yep.
So that wasn't new by any means to us, but we were able and very fortunate to bring in some folks to kind of take us to another level. And it was, I think, really the thing that wound up making us successful, like I said, was this incredibly robust intel capability that we went in with, that we weren't usually accustomed to. I mean, early on, with my team, my 5-man team, 6-man team, I had attached, my own kind of human analyst, my own geospatial analyst, my own SIGINT guy. And so that was pretty amazing to kind of see how everything really comes together and works. So when we landed in Iraq, we were going to be operating as a task unit underneath the SEAL architecture. Mm-hmm. We were the one point that I don't think anybody could disagree with is the Marine Corps was not very happy about this. They really weren't interested in having a special operations unit, and SOCOM was not really interested in having Marines. I don't think there were very many people who were really rooting for us. There were certainly, a thing that had always been the case, whenever we'd gone to schools with SF guys or with SEALs or trained, we trained with SEALs quite a bit. We always got along great on a one-on-one level, but as entities, the idea of Marines coming in SOCOM was not received well by anybody. We were incredibly fortunate that the SEAL commander that we were working for, Captain Bill Wilson, or later Captain Bill Wilson, was absolutely. He was like, "Hey, you're my boys, just like all these other guys, my boys. I'm going to treat you just like the rest of my boys." The first thing he did was said, "Since you're my boys, I'm going to, you guys have a lot more intel support than my other boys do, so I'm going to take away a lot of your intel support and spread load." And what we were, of course, pissed about that at the time, but the thing that came from that is very, very quickly, we had our own kind of eyes and ears all over, in the green zone, all over Iraq, with all the SEAL teams. So I feel like had this better intel picture than anybody else did. And the first mission that we executed, we were told when we got on the ground that hey, we're not relieving another SEAL team, so we don't have target packages to hand you. You've got to figure this out on your own. So it came down to our intel folks, just digging through, reporting, and coming up with a target. And that initial target was just like snowball effect, led to target. And by the end of the second week we were there, we were just hit raids every single night on bomb makers and financiers and knuckleheads of all sorts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I remember from one of my trips, like we were the only seventh group team under a 10th group AOB. And even though that's the same SF tribe, it's still different groups and all those things. And we were lucky as well. Ken Tovo's later, General Tovo was the battalion commander, and he was the same way for us. It was just like, hey, you're one of us, you're one of our teams now. We were actually, I think, a seventh group team under a first group B team under a 10th group AOB. So we were like way down the chain,
Yeah.
and he was great to us. Right. And it's always a tenuous relationship because you're coming in and you're not wearing the same patch and from the same unit and all those things. And so I'm glad to hear that that relationship was solidified right from the beginning. And it's funny, by kicking your intel out to some of his units, gave you a great L&O sort of network to start working all of those packages. As that, as that deployment continues, right? And as you said, like within 2 weeks, you guys are hitting all these raids and all those things. What do you remember of, again, it wasn't the first combat deployment, right? But now it's sort of the first combat deployment of this new element. What do you remember of sort of that baptism of fire and that SOP refinement of, okay, hey, we did our workup, we're the plank holders, and now it's real? Like, how do you remember that sort of matriculating?
It was it was interesting because we still had ties to the Marine Corps, and
Mm-hmm.
while we're there, Fallujah's kicking off, and we've got a lot of recon brothers that are there in the fight. We're not that far down the road. We're like, hey, let us go help these guys out. And they're like, no, we know that you can work with Marines. We need to see you work with other entities. And so I think when we got there and we started doing raids, everybody's like, yeah, I mean, we know you can do that. So it's not that big of a deal, so we need to find, uh, we need basically to come up with other missions and ways to sell ourselves, to prove ourselves. And, relatively early on in the deployment, that came as establishing or being part of a SEAL going to run security detail for the interim Iraqi government.
Mm-hmm.
And that was at the time they were president, two vice presidents, and cabinet members that I think we largely the provincial coalition authority largely selected and kind of put into place to enable the conditions for the first free election. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of people that wanted to obviously for the government not to be successful. So these guys, we were primarily responsible for the Kurdish vice president. And so he had like the biggest, crosshair on his head of anybody.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because none of the, there were a lot of Iraqis that weren't terribly fond of the Kurdish people, and him in particular had fought with the Peshmerga against Saddam, and so he had this just really great lineage, but was somebody that there were a lot of people that would have liked to seen him dead. So it was. Our ability to kind of integrate into that, both integrating from an intel perspective and then, from a running advanced security, for the detail and things of that nature, started to, I think open some people's eyes that, hey, these guys are capable of more than just, blowing down doors and shooting bad guys in the face.
Yeah. No, that's great. Do you remember, one of the things that SOCOM was created, as you mentioned, in 87, and one of the hallmarks of sort of throughout these, 38 years, I might have got that date right. I missed the MARSOC one, but pretty sure I got that one right. But, throughout this time, one of the hallmarks has been, hey, bringing everyone under this same banner produces more interoperability of equipment, of chains of command, of anything, communications, SOPs, all those things. Do you remember there being growing pains in interoperability as you guys were stepping into that? Or did you feel like, hey, because you fell right under that SEAL kind of command structure, that it was easier to integrate and there wasn't really any of those issues going back and forth between either the Air Force and SEALs and other Army folks and everybody else under the SOCOM umbrella?
Yeah, there was, we were fortunate or unfortunate, but for the test bid, like the charter of Det One for 2 years, the Marine Corps was told you have to pay for this. So, SOCOM was not funding our startup,
which they were even more happy about, I'm
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
But so we had a lot of great people that really helped out to make sure that we were equipped and armed on par with everybody else. So a lot of the civilians and military folks up at Natick Laboratories and the soft equipment from body armor, load carriage, night vision, optics, and weapons across the board. Really, really bent over backwards and found ways to make sure the Marine Corps' dollars stretch farther than they would have otherwise. Because the Marine Corps is not the most spendy of the services. I don't think that's should be common knowledge to most people. But so we were pretty well individually equipped with comm and everything else. Vehicles were a different matter. We had again, we thought we were going to our Afghanistan doing vehicle patrols, so we needed a primary vehicle that was helo mountable, helo loadable. So we had the Mercedes G wagons, and it had no money left over to rebuy when we found out that we weren't going. So we had cobbled together some old Humvees and let Army guys weld armor,
monster garage
stuff.
as we used to do. Yeah,
right. But so it did take a while when we were like, hey, we really need the same vehicles that everybody else has, and the SEALs came through with that and got us GMVs that were up armored and kitted out with everything that we needed. So I don't. There was definitely some growing pains, working with especially in planning, I think, but not a lot. We didn't do a lot of. We worked a lot with the GROM, the Poles who were kind of co-located with us. So there was some kind of growing pains with them on SOPs and things, but for the most part, our operations were relatively unilateral.
Sure.
So there weren't a lot of kind of on the ground, tactical issues or concerns.
Yeah, as you come to the end of that deployment and you start seeing like, hey, obviously we know now the proving ground was successful, right? Because MARSOC springs out of it and all those things. What do you remember as that transition as you're coming to the end of that deployment and you finish it out, and now these conversations are happening about, all right, Detachment One, Det One turning into an actual Marine Special Operations Command. What do you remember hearing about that, and what do you remember seeing as the result of that?
So we got back from deployment in would have been late 2004, and we knew that we had done a really good job.
Yeah.
The Marine Corps had and SOCOM had a couple of think tanks come and the Center for Naval Analysis and like examine what we had done and produce something. And they said that we did a good job and we had kind of proved the viability of Marine Corps Special Operations. But we spent another, nearly 2 years, well, a year, just kind of showing up at work and unsure of what our future was going to be. And every day there would be a different, we were going to deploy again, but this time to Afghanistan. We were going to deploy, there were rumors that we were going to kind of outright go and join, some other units as a kind of a standalone entity. Just every day is a different and crazier, rumor. We were going to, and really what we had anticipated and what we thought was that we would kind of split like an amoeba or something and form a Det 2, right? Half of us would go over and we'd hold a selection and we'd, repopulate both units, and we would kind of deploy and build and grow until we reached, finally the size that they wanted us to be at. So it was really, impossible, and we weren't invited, as team leaders. We weren't invited to the meetings that were going on in the Pentagon or down at SOCOM or at Quantico with the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
So we were, that's what we thought. We developed our own little more robust assessment of selection. And we took turns going through it. Half of us went through it, half of us evaluated it, and then we switched. Um, and it was about a year. I mean, there were sometimes they told us, "Hey, you guys are going away. Nobody wants you." Um, and there were a lot of the Marines that we had were more senior, so there were guys who were at retirement. They were like, "Hey, man,
Sure.
I'm out of here." There were guys that went on to other, units that were selected to go to other units. There were, so we started, our numbers kind of started dwindling. And after about a year, finally the decision was that, hey, you guys are going to be disbanded. And MARSOC's going to start up separately as a whole separate. And it was impossible to imagine at that point that, our little 100 dudes and 3 temporary shelters that we worked out of, would turn into a 2-star command with, thousands of Marines and civilians, sailors working for them. So it was there were a lot of us that were a little, not necessarily happy, about the way that we're just being told, "Hey, thank you for your service. Get the hell out of here. We'll take it from here." And so there were a lot of the Marines that kind of just went back to Force Recon or went wherever. I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to continue to take the lessons that I had learned and try to help bring them into MARSOC. So I accepted orders to come out to the East Coast and start up the school,
Yeah.
which was great. I'm glad that I did. Most of the Marine, or a lot of the Marines that went back to Force Recon wound up finding their way, because when MARSOC started, they took first and second Force Recon and just said, "Hey, now they took their unit flags away and said, now you're first and second Special Operations Battalion, and then later Raider Battalion." So it was it was just phenomenal to see, one, how you start a unit of this magnitude, a component of US SOCOM from scratch. Again, it was almost, in a lot of cases, there were similarities to when the Det started. I mean, you're kind of sitting around with nothing, and then, FedEx trucks just start, just showing up and just dumping, everything, that you need to run a unit, and you need to fight and go to war. You're getting dumped off. From my perspective at the school, it was a really phenomenal opportunity to say, "Hey, let me take all of and we took the opportunity to come down to Bragg and go to the Q course and, out to Buds and kind of look at what everybody was doing. Obviously what, the way Recon Marines were trained, and say, hey, how are we going to build our training pipeline? How are we going to build our assessment selection? How are we going to make sure that our guys, have all of the training that they need to be successful?" Because we were not, at this point, we weren't, cherry picking the, really experienced and seasoned guys. We were, necessarily having to open it up to much younger people with less experience in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting as well, because like most of our units within Special Operations Command, you mentioned it earlier, even before US SOCOM was created, these assessment and selection and training programs and all these things, I mean, have reached back for decades, right? And so the units and the elements are constantly tweaking them and making changes, but we all know in the military, it's harder to make changes than it is necessarily to like keep the ball rolling, because you have this history and lineage of like, hey, there's a reason that's part of the Q course or all these things. You guys, as you were standing up that school, it was already now post, in the middle of the GWOT, the early GWOT, and you're creating this assessment and selection. And as you said, I know you guys were able to go out and see some of the other ones and kind of create it. What do you remember from creating that and helping be a part of it, and now helping run it still as a civilian? What was the formation of that school and that assessment and selection like? And what did you specifically look at as like, all right, this is how we're going to do it, either the same or different than some of our other tribes are doing it right now?
Yeah, the one, you know, thing that we had that was absolutely a bonus and being late to the game is that we didn't have like this institutional memory in a lot of cases. So when I went down to brag, the first question I asked everybody was, hey, if you were starting over, how would you would you
Yeah.
do it? And it's talking, one of the things that because the Q course has been uh, going on so long that, and we hear about it, there's somebody wants to, we're going to move language, we're going to do, then there's a big uproar, it's,
Yep.
and then, it settles down and that's the way it's done. And then it happens again. And,
Yep.
So for us, we were really starting with a relatively clean slate, but there's also only kind of so many ways to skin a cat.
Sure.
So, I mean, you've got to start off with the basics. You've got to teach guys how to shoot, move, communicate, medicate, survive, and then you've got to, start putting them into, more challenging. I think there were absolutely some lessons that we had learned from some of the people from, various units that we're able to interact with when we were training with the Det, some mindset shifts, really. The Marine Corps, generally speaking, is especially in individual training phase, is very much, here's the task, here's the condition, here's the standard.
Right.
And it's very hard to train somebody like that when you want that person to be able to come up with new and innovative solutions and think outside the box. Right. So, we always say that we want free thinkers and things like that, but we don't train them that way. So really a lot of my focus was like, how do we, we're selecting people that we say are adaptable, they have initiative, they have all of these things. How do we then, let them demonstrate that and grow it? One of the things I read early on that had come out of the Q course was, it might have been in SOCOM magazine or it's an article, but they're really talking about the fact that when it comes to traits, they're either like kind of innate traits or they're malleable traits. Like you've got the things that you've got, you're not going to gain integrity, by the time you're a 19 or 20-year-old man. But, adaptability, you can certainly, be taught that. So, we've got to change the way the kind of the paradigm of how we train. So that was really a lot of my focus early on is how do we create the kind of mentality really that the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion of World War II created, where they were, it was just completely innovative. They were, at the time, enlisted men, were not expected to really think very much or a lot of them couldn't read, at this point, right? They're getting drafted. So the idea that the 2nd Raider Battalion really pushed that, hey, we're going to sit down after every training event and we want to hear your thoughts. The commander is like, hey, I want to hear the private's thoughts on how he could set up a blocking position better, or how he could do this better. And if it's a good idea, then we'll do it. So that was the sort of kind of mentality we tried to instill with the first course that we ran, and I think relatively successfully. Like you said, once the train gets on a track, it's very, very hard to move it off of that track. But I think we do a pretty good job of providing opportunities for all of the Marines. But I think it's expected of the officers, right? But especially the younger enlisted Marines, putting them in the hot seat that, hey, you're team chief today. What are you going to do?
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting because I think, there's always inter-service rivalries, and whether it's in special operations or just conventionally, whatever. But I think if you gave us all truth serum from across all the conventional militaries and all the different things, I think if we were to say, like, who do we from the outside think runs the best individual boot camp or basic training, right? It would be the Marine Corps, right? Like, people come out of the Marine Corps and, Marine Corps boot camp, they come out probably already with a USMC tattoo, but also with like, hey, they're wired tight. They believe and are fully integrated as Marines, and they know what's expected of them and they know how to do it, right? No matter what their job is, right? But then transitioning into the special operations realm of like, okay, Now you can execute when we tell you what we need you to do, task, condition, standard. Now we want to figure out, can you think on your feet? Can you think outside the box? And those are not incongruent ideas, but they are different lenses that you're looking at somebody, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times for us, we find, and it's probably the same across the board, but infantrymen, are sometimes a little more linear, in their thinking, because that's the way they're raised, and that's when you're told to take the hill, you take the hill. You don't say, "But hey, what if we went around?" That's not an option. You have a platoon sergeant or squad leader is going to put a boot in your ass. All right, so it a lot of times, and it's one of the there's always the discussion about the current generation of young people, and I definitely think that's one of the benefits of them, is that they see things a lot differently. They see a lot of different opportunities. They see, and they're not afraid to, they're accustomed to asking questions. So it's sometimes a little maddening, when they're when they are, but they also are, I think, a little more, in some ways, adaptable to situations than certainly I was when I came in.
Yeah, I think the problem-solving quotient as a whole is higher, right? Is what it seems like. And nothing's monolithic. Like, every individual is a little bit different, but it does seem generationally like the problem-solving, thinking outside the box. Sometimes that quotient does seem higher in some ways. It's always been interesting to me from being within special operations. Like, it is a weird kind of push and pull, especially as we talk about being like a team sergeant or a platoon sergeant, all those things of like, I need guys and gals that are able to execute when given something, but also know the right time to say like, hey, what if we did this? And there's always that push and pull between that. And so that's why I'm always interested in the assessment and selection process and the training programs and things like that, because I saw guys when I was going through the Q course that were wired tight infantry guys who had come from, what a team member of mine used to call a stellar background, right? Like either from Ranger Regiment, 82nd, 101st, like infantry guy, Ranger tabbed, had done all those things, that struggled a little bit with either the ambiguity of situations at time and not having like clear-cut orders, or struggled with others left and right of them being more like, hey, what if we, like you said, what if we took what if we took a completely different look at this, drove completely around this hill and did something totally out of, no one's ever heard of. And it's like, whoa, we can't do that, right? And it's like, well, why? Check the rule book, as one of my team sergeants used to say, like, well, let's check the rule book. The rule book doesn't say it's wrong, so let's try it, right? So it's always interesting. And now, talk to me about your role now. Right, you retire, you come back in, into service as a government civilian, working in that kind of ascension process of becoming, new MARSOC raiders. You get to talk and see to, all of these different new raiders coming through. How's that been working for you, and what's your lens now as sort of the guy on the other side who's trying to teach and mentor some of the instructors?
Yeah, for me, it's phenomenal. So I retired in MARSOC started February 23rd of 2006. Like I said, I was here essentially then, working to get the school stood up and the course started. I retired in July 2008, and we started the first Raider course in September of 2008. So I was a civilian before the first course started. Yeah. We just graduated class 33. So now we've, 2 a year. That, I've been doing this as a civilian for nearly as long as I was in the Marine Corps at this point. It's been, because I took about like 2 weeks off between retiring and starting. For me, people talk a lot of time about, transition. How was your transition? I didn't transition. There was so much to be done. I had a beard, but and started letting my hair grow a little bit, but I wasn't in uniform. But other than that, it was kind of all hands on deck, working to 18, 2000, 2200, just getting everything ready, to everything you need to start a 9-month, 10-month training pipeline. So it really took me a few years before it finally clicked that, oh, by the way, yeah, you're not, you're not an active duty guy anymore. Yeah. And, I also realized at some point you have to realize that you can't care about this more than the active duty guys do. And they care about it a lot. So, I finally, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, realized that I kind of needed to shift my role from being the guy pushing the train to the guy, supporting the guys who do push the train. So taking on, and it's been like incredibly rewarding for me to kind of take on a role of a mentor or a coach more. There's still some times when the platoon sergeant wants to come out and I want to, scream, yell at guys, but I like have a moment of zen and realize that, hey man, this is not my, I'm not the guy that's got to yell at the student, that doesn't want to tread water in the pool and wants to grab on the side. I need to get him and let him do his job, get the instructor, let them do, what they're best at. And, it's incredibly rewarding to get to, now I've seen, Marines come through the course and, come back as instructors, come back now as senior enlisted leaders within the command. So it's phenomenal. I tell everybody, I have the greatest job in the world, I think. And, it's every day I realize that, these guys are, and gals now, and some of our orders, parts of the organization are, they're smarter, they're stronger, they're faster, they're better looking, they're kind of across the board. I'm lucky to have lived enough of a life where I've got some, useful tidbits to share with them from time to time.
Yeah. Well, it's super cool because, even if you had only been there as the beginning of that, assessment and selection program and all those things, but to be one of those guys that was leading Det One and then see this now turn into, as you said, a 2-star command, a component under US SOCOM, 3 Raider battalions, like all these things, as you reflect on that, like, what's your view of looking back at that start of Det One of just like, hey, we're just trying to pick guys off a roster and figure it out, to now as you drive into work every day and see what it's turned into? Like, what's that reflection for you?
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think it's more amazing because I really believe that we've, at the heart of MARSOC are really the core fundamentals of what we believed when we started Det One. And the book that I wrote, has the title "Tough Rugged Bastards," and that came from our commander at Det One, Colonel Bob Coates. And he pulled me in and told me that, hey, you're a team leader, you get to pick your team. He's like, you know what I want? I want tough, rugged bastards with strong backs and hard feet. And that's the one thing, because it really doesn't matter how smart you are or how capable you are, whatever insert platforms you have or what schools you have, at the end of the day, it's, wars are always going to be won by, tough, rugged bastards. And, I think even more so looking to the future, there's probably going to be a whole lot more, requirement for hard feet, than there was. There's probably gonna be a lot bigger rucks, being carried again. There's going to be a lot of lessons that, both from the early days of the GWOT, but even further back, we're really looking at, what, guys were doing in Vietnam, for a lot of things, communications wise, and LPI, LPD type of, being able to talk without, reduced signature reduction. A lot of old school ways I think are going to make their way full circle.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I can remember my own career as MARSOC was starting, as a Green Beret. Like you said, you're not really concerned with like the overarching SOCOM and how it fits and whatever. You're like, hey, who are these guys? They're trying to take some of our jobs or whatever. It's like, well, who's this startup? And I remember, now having so many friends that are Raiders and having worked with them in training and in combat and in the command and all these things. And, hugely successful program that you guys have run as far as bringing in really great men and women and making them into great special operators. So I think it's been a rousing success. I'm glad you brought up the book, because I wanted to get to that as, as we kind of finish up our time. You go through all of this stuff, you're training all these guys, you're setting up MARSOC and the assessment and selection program. And at some point you decide, like, hey, creative writing, like, I want to get into that. Yeah. I'm just interested of, like, when did that start? How did that pull? And how is that, one of the things that I've been interested in the tail end of my career is I was doing a lot of the human performance stuff and really working on a lot of the stuff that I was going through personally, was like these creative outlets that guys find to express themselves in a different way, right? What's the role of creative writing, and how have you found that to work in as you continue, kind of your journey through this life?
Yeah, it was, I get that question all the time, and to me, it made perfect sense.
Yeah.
I had always enjoyed writing. I had some articles published, like, in kind of military journals and things like that while I was in. And when I got out, I had the GI Bill. I got out, retired just about a year before I was able to give that to my children. So I was like, hey, I'm gonna use this. I'm gonna use every dime of it. And I had barely finished up a bachelor's degree before I retired. And that was a lot of, just a lot of long nights trying to cobble together classes and things. But after I was retired for a year or two, I was like, yeah, I got to get busy on this GI Bill. And the creative writing program at the University of North Carolina was one of the few that didn't require a GMAT, which is a test that I was afraid of taking. So that made it look even better, so I signed up for that, and it was, I was fortunate to get selected. It's a pretty competitive program. And, that was absolutely gave me a whole new perspective to look at life, going to college in a master's program at 42, with the sorts of people who were in creative writing programs, had most of them very, very different life experiences than I had. So it was a unique and really rewarding, experience. But I do believe that, and I've worked with some veterans charities or different groups that encourage, people to write their stories. If nothing else, put them on paper and, maybe get it out of your head. But it's, something your kids might want to read someday, or your family might want to read someday. So even if you have no interest in, and there's always a little bit of a stigma that, you're supposed to be quiet professionals, that, so I was a little reluctant to write it. I was a little reluctant to tell anybody that I had written it, but, now it's been rewarding. I've had a lot of people, especially young Marines, come up and, thank me for writing it, or to tell them that it kind of talks about a part of history that they didn't know about. So I'm it's hard to kind of take on when you're kind of used to being the gray man or whatever, the role of hey, here, buy my book, and I'm a writer now, so I'm a social media influencer or whatever. It's a little odd, but it's also like I said, been a rewarding experience.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, it parallels for me, and we talked about it, before, is like, I'm all about the quiet professional thing. And I 100% believe that is the right way for us to approach what we do as special operators. But I also think there is so much history and lessons learned and windows in that, when done correctly, whether it's through books, whether it's through podcasts like this, like, as a young guy, when I was looking at joining the 18 X-ray program, all of this didn't exist as far as podcasts and all the social media where you could just, like, now I laugh with some of my buddies that, like, kids are hitting us up in direct messages and asking us questions about things that, like, we had no idea, we had no interaction with any special operator that we could just ask these questions. Right. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was like, hey, you went and found, just like you did, every book you could find, right? Like every special forces book about Vietnam, I was reading it to just try to figure out, like, hey, what am I getting myself into? Like, what are the traits that I need to have and all those things? And so I think there's 100% a space within the quiet professional sort of ethos to do it correctly, to, whether it's book, podcast, whatever it is, and share those stories to inspire others, to pass on lessons learned, to capture that history. And so, I think it's awesome that you were able to do it and that you're able to continue to mentor folks who are thinking about, like, hey, how can I do this right? It's not self-aggrandizing. I'm not, trying to look for fame or fortune out of it. It is as a steward of the profession, and as all of us as Americans, and especially as special operations veterans, I want the next crop of great men and women as young Americans to see this as a pathway to get all of the, the service that's needed for the nation, but also as a pathway to have a life that they'd never have. Like, I'm like you, I growing up, I wouldn't be in the position I'm in now without having been able to be refined and matured through my time in special operations and have opportunities that I would have never had in a million years if I would have just stuck my head in the dirt and stayed where I grew up. And so I think it's an amazing opportunity. One of the things that I'm always interested in when I talk to someone like you with the history and all of the insight that you have across so many years, both in force, then at Det One, and now throughout your time at MARSOC, what's your message to that young kid right now who's listening to this, who's thinking, man, I don't know, is that something I should do? Is that something I can do? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely was a young kid, questioning, of course, like I said, after seeing Rambo, after reading, all the books about Vietnam, I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But kind of when you're put at the moment of truth, you're like, can I do this? Should I do this? Am I going to let these guys down? Which was the thing that always pushed me. I think, and I tell this to young people when they do ask me, is, just be very, very clear about why you want to do this, understand. And like you said, it's much easier now. You can get kind of the ground truth from a lot of sources that, hey, it's a hard life. But man, it's a rewarding one. And I think to your point that, if we all say that, hey, we're going to be quiet professionals, the only people that, anybody's going to hear from are the people who are not. So, I do think it's, and I've kind of repeat that to myself, when I start like doubting myself that, I think those of us that have, stories, lessons that we can pass on, I think we have, a bit of an obligation to, and we can still be professionals, just a little less silent.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, man, John, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you being willing to come join us. I appreciate your lens into this window of history on the Marine side, and really, again, what you continue to do day in and day out, helping produce MARSOC Raiders that are out there getting after it. And I know our audience appreciates your time, and I just want to say thank you and much respect for everything you've done and what you continue to do, brother. I really appreciate your time today.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And thanks for continuing to, provide this opportunity for, people to come in and talk with you.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate it. And on behalf of General Fenton, everybody at US SOCOM, thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to another episode of SOFcast. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode of SOFcast. No matter where you find our show, do us a favor, go give us a like, a follow, and share it with somebody in your network who might enjoy this episode. Also, please go give us a 5-star review. It really does help other people find the show. If there's someone else that you'd like to hear from or a topic you'd like to hear about, please shoot us an email, sofcast@socom.mil. And while you're at it, go check us out on social media at US SOCOM, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, X, LinkedIn, wherever. Follow along with what's going on with U.S. Special Operations Command and with the show. And on behalf of all of us from General Fenton on down at U.S. Special Operations Command, thanks for listening to another episode of SOFcast.